August 1944. The Atlantic was a vast, indifferent canvas of gray, its surface a cold skin stretched tight over a fathomless depth. For the women huddled in the cavernous hold of the American transport ship, the ocean was not a geographical feature, but a liquid purgatory, a suffocating void separating the world they had fought for from the one they were being dragged to. They were a collection of ghosts in worn feldgrau, their faces etched with the soot of a collapsing continent and the hard, brittle certainty of their convictions. These were the Helferinnen, the female auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe, signals operators, administrative clerks, anti-aircraft assistants. They were not merely cogs in the war machine, they were its true believers. Women raised on a diet of mythic destiny and sacrificial duty, their identities forged in the crucible of the Bund Deutscher Mädel and hardened by the relentless Allied bombing of their cities. Their world was one of rigid order, of clearly defined roles where a woman's highest calling was to be a silent, steadfast pillar for the Reich, a mother to its future, a servant to its present. They had seen their homes turn to rubble, their brothers and fathers march off to a frozen hell in the east, their entire reality consumed by the purifying fire of total war. And in their minds, the architect of this suffering, the true enemy, was not the grim-faced Soviet soldier, but the decadent, weak, and racially mongrelized American. Their propaganda had painted a vivid picture of the United States. It was a nation of gangsters and jazz-addled degenerates, a flimsy commercial empire run by Jews and plutocrats, its army a cowardly mob of ill-disciplined factory boys who would break at the first sign of real hardship. They expected America to be a land of chaos and moral decay, a place where weakness was mistaken for compassion, and where the very fabric of society was rotten to the core. They anticipated either brutal barbaric treatment, confirming the enemy's subhuman nature, or a foolish, soft-hearted laxity that they could exploit. They were prepared for anything but the truth. As the ship cut through the waves, a low, constant thrum vibrating through the steel plates beneath them, they steeled themselves, reinforcing their ideological armor. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also custodians of a superior truth, missionaries of a defeated but not yet dead God. They huddled together, not just for warmth, but for ideological solidarity, their shared glances a silent promise to remain unbroken, to observe the enemy's weakness, and to carry the knowledge of his inferiority back to the inevitable Fourth Reich. The air in the hold was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and a defiant, unyielding pride. They were the daughters of Germania, and they would not be bent. The first crack in this armor appeared not with a threat or a blow, but with a quiet, mundane act that was so profoundly alien it defied immediate comprehension. Disembarking under the humid, oppressive sky of a Virginia port, they were processed not by sneering male soldiers, but by women. These were American women in crisp military uniforms, members of the Women's Army Corps. They were not frantic or flustered. They were calm, efficient, and unnervingly professional. One of them, a lieutenant with hair the color of straw and a jawline that suggested a stubborn refusal to be intimidated, moved down the line of German prisoners, her clipboard held with an easy authority. She wasn't beautiful in the classical Aryan sense that had been drilled into them. She was too lean, too direct, her movements too economical. She gave orders to the male guards, who responded with a crisp "yes, ma'am" that was devoid of either irony or resentment. The German women watched, their minds struggling to categorize the scene. In their world, a woman's authority was derived from the party or her husband. It was a delegated secondary power. This American woman's authority seemed to emanate from herself, from her rank and her competence. It was innate, unquestioned. This had to be a show, a carefully staged piece of theater for their benefit, a propaganda play to demoralize them. It was the only explanation that made sense. Their journey continued by train, a rattling, clattering passage into the American heartland. For days, they stared out of the grime-streaked windows at a landscape that was itself a form of psychological warfare. They had expected to see a nation strained by war, its resources stretched thin, its people showing the telltale signs of deprivation. Instead, they saw an endless, rolling panorama of impossible prosperity. They saw towns that had never heard the wail of an air raid siren, their streets lined with intact houses, each with a small, manicured lawn. They saw fields of corn and wheat stretching to the horizon, so vast and green they seemed to be mocking the memory of Germany's meager ration cards. They saw automobiles, not just military vehicles or the charcoal-burning jalopies of the party elite, but shiny private cars driven by civilians, sometimes by women, who zipped along paved roads with a casual, thoughtless freedom. The sheer, unscarred, and arrogant scale of it all was an assault. Each passing town, each fully stocked shop window they glimpsed, each herd of fat, healthy cattle was another small chip hammered away at their certainty. This wasn't a nation on its knees. This was a nation that didn't even seem to realize it was in a fight for its life. The destination was a place of red dirt and relentless sun. Camp Aliceville, Alabama. It was a sprawling, hastily constructed city of tar paper barracks surrounded by barbed wire, a lonely outpost in a sea of cotton fields. Here, the ideological assault intensified, shifting from the macro to the micro, from the landscape to the people. The camp was run by Americans, both men and women, who treated them with a detached, almost bureaucratic correctness that was more unnerving than outright cruelty. They were given clean clothes, regular meals, and medical checkups. The food was bland but plentiful: white bread, potatoes, canned meat, and coffee with real sugar, luxuries that had become distant memories in Germany. This material abundance was disorienting, but it was still something they could process through the lens of propaganda. The Americans were trying to buy their loyalty, to fatten them up like pigs before the slaughter, to prove their wasteful, materialistic nature. It was a crude tactic, and the German women met it with contemptuous silence, their discipline a shield against this soft corruption. They performed their assigned duties within the camp: laundry, cooking, cleaning, with a rigid efficiency, their movements sharp, their faces impassive. They were determined to show their captors that German spirit could not be broken by powdered milk and processed cheese. The true cognitive dissonance began when they were assigned to work details outside the camp's perimeter. Under the watchful eyes of a few guards, they were trucked to local farms and canneries to supplement the wartime labor shortage. It was here, in the humid fields and noisy factories of rural Alabama, that they were forced into close, daily proximity with the creature they had been taught to despise and pity: the American woman. And what they saw shattered their worldview into 1,000 pieces. They saw farmers' wives and daughters driving tractors, their arms muscled and tan from the sun, their faces streaked with dirt and sweat. They saw them repairing engines, their hands slick with grease, their brows furrowed in concentration. They saw them managing accounts, arguing with suppliers, and hiring and firing male farm hands with a directness that would have been unthinkable back home. These women were not delicate, protected creatures. They were tough, practical, and self-reliant. They worked as hard as any man, yet they had not lost their femininity. After a long day, they would wash up, put on a clean dress, and laugh and joke with an easygoing familiarity that bespoke a deep and unshakable self-confidence. They were everything the German women were not: loud, independent, and utterly unconcerned with a grand, abstract destiny. What you've just witnessed is the first tremor in a psychological earthquake. The foundations of their entire belief system are starting to crack. If you want to see how these cracks widen into chasms, make sure you're subscribed and have hit the notification bell. The initial reaction of the German prisoners was a predictable mix of scorn and disbelief. They saw the American women's behavior as uncivilized, a grotesque parody of masculinity. They whispered among themselves in the barracks at night, their words sharp with derision. They mocked the way the American women wore trousers for work, the way they chewed gum, the way their laughter was often too loud, too uninhibited. This was clear evidence of the social decay their leaders had warned them about. A society that allowed its women to behave like men was a society that had lost its moorings, its sense of natural order. It was a sign of desperation, a last-ditch effort by a nation that had to send its women into the fields because its men were too cowardly to fight effectively. This interpretation was a comforting balm, a way to reassert the superiority of their own culture, which placed woman on a pedestal of domestic virtue, the sacred keeper of the hearth and the race. The American woman, by contrast, seemed to have willingly descended from this pedestal to wallow in the muck of men's work. They were to be pitied, not admired. This cynical framework, however, began to buckle under the weight of sustained daily observation. The German women were intelligent and perceptive. They had been trained to observe, to analyze, and the more they watched, the more they realized that what they were seeing was not an aberration. It was the norm. The female tractor driver was not a lonely exception. Her neighbors did the same. The woman managing the cannery payroll was not a wartime anomaly. She had been the bookkeeper for years. This independence, this competence, was not a frantic response to crisis, but the established, mundane reality of American life. They saw women driving into town alone to do the week's shopping, their cars loaded with groceries that would have constituted a king's feast in Berlin. They saw teenage girls working as cashiers in the local stores, handling money with a casual proficiency, making decisions, and interacting with adult customers as peers. The entire social architecture was different. Power and agency were not hoarded by the state and doled out to men. They seemed to be diffused throughout the population, accessible to anyone with the will and the ability to grasp them, regardless of their gender. The most jarring discovery, however, was not economic or social, but personal. The German women began to notice the relationships between the American men and women. They saw husbands and wives working side by side, their interactions marked by a spirit of partnership, not hierarchy. They saw banter, teasing, and arguments that were resolved through discussion, not by the assertion of male authority. They watched a farmer and his wife lean against a fence at the end of the day, smoking cigarettes and talking quietly, their postures conveying a relaxed equality that was utterly foreign. In the world the German women came from, the family was a rigid pyramid with the man at the apex. A woman's role was to support, to obey, to sacrifice. To see a man consult his wife's opinion on when to plant or whether to buy a new piece of equipment was a revelation. It suggested that a woman's mind, her judgment, was considered valuable. It was a quiet, almost invisible revolution happening in front of their eyes, and it struck at the very heart of their understanding of the world. But this was just the beginning. The small, personal observations were about to coalesce into a much larger, more terrifying picture of American strength. These everyday scenes began to accumulate, forming a mosaic of American life that was profoundly at odds with everything they had been taught. The propaganda had spoken of American women as frivolous, obsessed with makeup and Hollywood movies. And while it was true that the American women seemed to have an endless supply of lipstick and went to the cinema on Saturday nights, these were not the defining features of their existence. They were accessories to a life of hard work and surprising autonomy. The German prisoners watched as a local woman, the postmistress, would not only sort the mail, but also offer her unsolicited and often sharp opinions on politics to the men who gathered to collect their letters. They saw a female teacher in the small-town schoolhouse who was a respected community leader, organizing scrap metal drives and war bond rallies with a formidable energy that rivaled any party officials. These women were not just participating in the war effort, they were leading it at a grassroots level, not because they were ordered to, but because they seemed to believe it was their right and their duty as citizens. This constant exposure created a state of profound cognitive dissonance in the German women. The reality they were witnessing daily was in such stark, irrefutable conflict with their deeply ingrained ideology that their minds began to short-circuit. They had been taught that the National Socialist system, with its clearly defined gender roles and its focus on collective sacrifice, was the most efficient and powerful social structure in the world. It was a system designed for strength and resilience. Yet, here was its antithesis. A society that appeared loose, individualistic, and almost chaotic in its distribution of freedom. And this society was not just functioning, it was thriving. It was outproducing, out-innovating, and out-fighting their own. The evidence was irrefutable. It was in the quality of the tools they were given to work with on the farms, the endless supply of fuel for the tractors, the sheer variety of food in the stores, and the healthy, well-fed bodies of the people they met. The conclusion was as terrifying as it was inescapable. Their ideology was built on a lie. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating. It began as a slow, corrosive drip of envy. They found themselves watching the American women with a mixture of awe and a bitter, hollow feeling in the pits of their stomachs. They saw a woman buy her child a brightly colored toy, a casual act of maternal affection that was an impossible luxury in a country where every scrap of metal was destined for the munitions factory. They saw a group of young women, factory workers on their day off, laughing as they drove a sputtering automobile to a nearby lake for a swim, their lives seemingly untouched by the existential dread that had been the constant companion of every German youth. These small moments of ordinary happiness were like daggers. They forced the German women to confront what their own lives lacked, what had been sacrificed on the altar of the Reich. They had been promised glory and a 1,000-year empire, but in exchange, they had been given ashes, rubble, and the grim, joyless duty of propping up a crumbling facade. The American women, who had been promised nothing more than life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, seemed to possess a strength and a vitality that the German women, for all their discipline and ideological purity, could no longer muster. This personal envy was quickly spiraling into a systemic crisis of faith, a realization that the war was being lost not just on the battlefield, but in the very soul of their nation. The core of their psychological unraveling lay in the constant brutal act of comparison. Every mundane detail of American life became a mirror reflecting the deficiencies of their own. When they were handed a sack lunch for their work detail, the simple, perfect apple inside would trigger a cascade of memories. The worm-eaten, carefully rationed fruit of their own homeland, the ache of a perpetual, gnawing hunger. The sight of an American woman casually applying a fresh coat of red lipstick was a stark reminder of a world where such small vanities had been condemned as decadent and unpatriotic, where a woman's beauty was supposed to be found in her childbearing hips and her capacity for hard, unpaid labor. They remembered the endless drives for scrap metal, for winter clothing, for any resource that could be fed into the insatiable maw of the war. They remembered the posters that glorified sacrifice, that made a virtue of deprivation. Here, in America, abundance was not a sin. It was a baseline, an assumed condition of life. This wasn't just a difference in economic output, it was a fundamental difference in philosophy. The American system seemed designed to provide for its people, while their own system was designed to consume them. The contrast was most acute in the realm of information. In Germany, the flow of information was a tightly controlled torrent, channeled through the state-run press and radio, every word sculpted to serve the regime's narrative. Dissent was treason, and doubt was a disease to be excised. In Alabama, they saw people reading different newspapers, papers that sometimes criticized the government, that reported on military setbacks alongside victories. They overheard arguments about President Roosevelt's policies, debates that were passionate but not fatal. The idea that a nation could tolerate, even encourage, such internal dissent and not collapse was baffling. Their own society was a monolith, held together by fear and force, demanding absolute ideological conformity. It was strong, yes, but it was also brittle. America, they began to see, was something else. It was messy, loud, and inefficient, but it was also flexible, resilient. Its strength didn't come from a single, unyielding ideology, but from the chaotic, competing energies of its free citizens. The freedom of the American woman to have an opinion, to voice it, to be wrong, was a symptom of a deeper, more powerful national immune system. This led to a slow, agonizing reevaluation of their own sacrifices. For what exactly had they given up their youth, their freedom, their futures? They had been told it was for the purity of the race, for Lebensraum, for the glory of the fatherland. They had believed it with a fervor that bordered on religious ecstasy, but standing in a sun-drenched Alabama field, watching an ordinary woman live a life of small, tangible freedoms, those grand, abstract concepts began to feel thin and hollow. The American woman was fighting for something concrete: her home, her family, her right to live as she chose. The German women were fighting for a myth, a dark and demanding fantasy that had consumed everything they loved. A profound sense of humiliation began to set in. It was the humiliation of the duped, the shame of realizing that your most sacred beliefs were not just wrong, but foolish. They felt a grudging, bitter respect for the very people they were supposed to despise. The American women were not the weak, coddled creatures of propaganda. They were, in their own way, warriors. They were fighting the war not with rifles, but with welding torches, with tractors, with war bonds, and with an unyielding, optimistic belief in their own way of life. The realization that they had been fighting for a fantasy was a devastating blow, but the true moment of ideological collapse was yet to come, and it would arrive in a form they never could have anticipated. The psychological toll was immense. The rigid certainty that had been their armor was now a cage, and the bars were beginning to melt. At night, in the stifling heat of the barracks, the silence was often broken by the sound of a woman weeping softly in her bunk. During the day, their movements became less sharp. Their faces lost their impassive masks, replaced by a weary, haunted expression. They were adrift in a sea of contradictions. How could a nation so dedicated to individual comfort produce such a formidable military? How could a society that allowed its women such latitude maintain the discipline necessary to wage a global war? The propaganda had provided easy answers. American strength was a hollow facade, a product of material wealth, not spiritual fortitude. But what they were seeing contradicted this at every turn. The wealth was not just material. It was a wealth of spirit, of confidence, of a fundamental belief in the individual's worth. The German women had been taught that the individual was nothing, that the Volk was everything. But here, the strength of the whole seemed to be derived directly from the strength of its individual parts. The comparison extended to their own bodies. The German women, products of years of rationing and stress, were mostly thin, their skin pale, their eyes holding a permanent, hunted look. They looked at the American women, the farmers' daughters, the town clerks, the factory workers, and saw a vitality that was almost insulting. They were healthy, well-fed, their movements imbued with an energy that came from a life free of constant gnawing anxiety. Their smiles were easy and frequent, not the tight, forced grimaces of official photographs. This physical difference was a constant, visible reminder of the two societies. One was consuming its people, burning them as fuel for its ideological furnace. The other, for all its flaws and chaos, seemed to be nurturing them. The envy the German prisoners felt was no longer just for the material goods, the cars, the food, the nylon stockings. It was for something far more profound, a sense of security, of agency, of a future that was not preordained by the state, but was theirs to build or to squander. They began to feel a deep, gnawing shame for their own gaunt reflections in the barracks windows. This internal crisis manifested in small acts of rebellion against their own ingrained discipline. A few of the women began to subtly mimic the American women, letting their hair grow a little longer, attempting to style it in a less severe fashion. Others started to use the small wages they earned from their labor to buy items from the camp canteen, not just necessities, but small luxuries like a bar of chocolate or a tube of lipstick, items they would have once scorned as symbols of decadence. These were not grand gestures of defiance against their captors, but something far more significant, a rebellion against their former selves. They were tentative, clumsy attempts to reclaim a piece of the individuality that had been systematically stripped from them by their own culture. Each small act of personal choice was a crack in the monolithic facade of their group identity, a quiet admission that the American way of life, for all its perceived chaos, held a powerful, undeniable allure. The solid block of German womanhood was beginning to fracture, splintering into individual women, each grappling with the terrifying, liberating possibility that their entire lives had been a lie. The final symbolic event that would shatter their ideology completely didn't happen on a farm or in a factory, but in the heart of the small Alabama town. If you find this psychological journey as fascinating as we do, consider supporting our channel on Patreon. Your support allows us to tell these forgotten stories. It happened on a sweltering Saturday afternoon. A group of the German prisoners, including the most hardened and cynical among them, were being transported through the town square after a week of work. Their truck was forced to stop to allow a parade to pass. It was not a military parade. There were no soldiers, no tanks, no display of martial power. It was a civilian affair, a war bond drive, organized and run almost entirely by the women of the town. The high school band, A motley collection of teenagers in slightly ill-fitting uniforms marched enthusiastically, if not perfectly, playing a Sousa march. Following them were the town's women, organized by clubs and associations, the Ladies' Auxiliary, the Garden Club, the Church Sodality. They were not in uniform. They wore their own clothes, bright summer dresses, practical slacks, wide-brimmed hats to ward off the sun. They carried hand-painted signs and banners. They were laughing, calling out to friends in the crowd, their energy a chaotic, vibrant symphony of civic engagement. The German women watched from the back of the truck, their faces a mixture of confusion and awe. In Germany, such an event would have been a meticulously staged spectacle of state power. Every participant would have been in uniform. Every banner would have borne an official slogan. Every movement would have been choreographed to perfection. The entire affair would have been designed to project an image of monolithic, unshakable unity, orchestrated from the top down. This American parade was the complete opposite. It was messy, amateurish, and deeply, profoundly personal. A stout middle-aged woman whom they recognized from the local cannery stood on a makeshift stage, a megaphone in her hand, her voice cracking with emotion as she urged her neighbors to buy bonds. She wasn't a party official. She was just Mrs. Henderson. She wasn't reading a prepared speech. She was speaking from the heart, her appeal a mixture of patriotic duty, community pride, and a fierce, maternal desire to bring the local boys home safely. The crowd responded, not with a rigid salute, but with cheers, applause, and a steady stream of people walking up to the bond table to hand over their hard-earned money. This was the moment of epiphany, the symbolic shift that changed everything. The German women had been struggling to understand the source of American strength, looking for it in their factories and their vast fields. But here it was, in this chaotic, heartfelt, and voluntary display of collective will. They suddenly understood. The rights and freedoms of the American woman were not a weakness. They were not a sign of decadence or a symptom of social decay. They were the very engine of the American war machine. The Nazis had built their power on coercion, on fear, on the suppression of the individual. America, it seemed, had built its power on the opposite principle. It had unleashed the potential of its people, trusting them, empowering them. The woman with the megaphone was not an anomaly. She was the system working as designed. She was a free citizen, voluntarily contributing her time, her passion, and her persuasive power to the war effort, and she was 100 times more effective than any uniformed party functionary barking orders. The strength of America wasn't in its government or its army. It was in its Mrs. Hendersons. In that moment, sitting in the dust and heat in the back of a rattling truck, the German women experienced the ultimate defeat. It was not a military defeat of flags and surrender documents. It was a profound spiritual and ideological annihilation. Their entire worldview, a structure built on the foundation of order, discipline, and the submission of the individual to the state, had been proven not just wrong, but catastrophically inefficient. They had been taught that freedom was chaos, that individualism was weakness, that a woman's power lay in her quiet, domestic sacrifice. And they had watched, with their own eyes, as a nation built on the very principles they despised, a nation that granted its women an almost unimaginable degree of freedom, had harnessed that freedom into a force so powerful it was crushing their own world into dust. The parade was not just a parade, it was a living, breathing demonstration of a superior form of social organization. It was a system that drew its strength not from the commands of a distant Führer, but from the voluntary, energetic, and deeply personal commitment of its free citizens. The women in the brightly colored dresses were not just selling war bonds. They were wielding a weapon the Third Reich could never hope to match. The power of a people who believed they were fighting for themselves. The realization settled over them like a shroud. The war was already over. It had been over from the moment the first American woman drove a rivet into the wing of a B-17, not because she was forced to, but because she chose to. It had been over from the moment the first farmer's wife decided to buy another war bond instead of a new dress. This decentralized grassroots power, this national strength that bubbled up from below rather than being imposed from above, was an invincible force. The German war machine, for all its terrifying efficiency and ruthless discipline, was a rigid, brittle thing. It could be broken, But how could you break a nation where every citizen, man or woman, was a self-motivated soldier in the cause? How could you defeat an enemy whose greatest strength was the very freedom you had condemned as your greatest weakness? The sense of humiliation was now complete, replaced by a cold, empty feeling of despair. They were not just prisoners of war. They were relics of a failed experiment, believers in a false god. The journey back to the camp was silent. The usual whispered comments and cynical observations were gone. The women sat hunched on the wooden benches, staring at the floor of the truck, each lost in her own private universe of shattered certainties. The red Alabama dust that coated their uniforms felt like the dust of their own ruined cities, the setting sun like the twilight of their gods. They had arrived in America as proud soldiers, convinced of their own spiritual superiority. They would leave it as something else entirely, witnesses to a truth they could never unsee. The image of the woman with the megaphone, her face earnest and sweating in the sun, would be seared into their minds forever. She was the face of their defeat, a symbol of a power so vast and so fundamentally different from their own that it defied all their categories of understanding. Their ideology hadn't just been defeated on the battlefield, it had been rendered obsolete. The final chapter of their story would be written not in a POW camp, but in the ruins of the nation they had once called home. The lessons learned in America would become a secret, a burden, and for a few, a new beginning. The war in Europe ended. The news reached Camp Aliceville through radio broadcasts and newspapers, a distant echo of a cataclysm that had consumed their world. For the German women, there was no joy in the coming peace, only a profound and weary numbness. The official notification of their country's unconditional surrender was a mere formality, a confirmation of what they had already understood in their souls that day in the town square. They were the survivors of a shipwrecked faith, and now they had to learn to live on a new shore. The process of repatriation was slow and bureaucratic. In the final months of their captivity, the dynamic in the camp changed. The rigid discipline they had maintained for so long finally dissolved. The ideological solidarity that had bound them together frayed and then snapped. They were no longer a unified group of Helferinnen. They were just women, tired and broken, facing an uncertain future alone. The journey home was the reverse of their arrival, a voyage back through the looking glass. They crossed the same gray Atlantic, but this time they were not filled with defiant pride, but with a quiet, anxious dread. They saw their homeland from the decks of the ship, and it was a landscape of apocalyptic ruin. The cities they had left as functioning centers of a powerful empire were now skeletal husks, mountains of rubble punctuated by the spires of bombed-out churches. This was the physical manifestation of their ideological defeat. This was the end result of the philosophy of total submission, of a society that consumed its own children. The contrast with the unscratched, prosperous America they had just left was so stark, so brutal, that it bordered on the surreal. They had been part of a system that had promised them a glorious future and had delivered only this: a nation in ruins, a people starving, a generation lost. In the years that followed, the women who had been imprisoned at Camp Aliceville scattered across the divided, recovering nation. They tried to rebuild their lives, to find work, to raise families amid the scarcity and shame of post-war Germany. Most of them never spoke of their time in America. It was a secret, a private memory that was too complex, too contradictory to share with those who had not seen it. How could they explain the baffling kindness of their captors to a husband who had lost a leg at Stalingrad? How could they describe the abundance of an Alabama grocery store to a mother who was still foraging for edible roots? How could they articulate the devastating power of a voluntary war bond drive to a brother who was being re-educated by the Soviets in the East? Their experience was an inconvenient truth, a story that fit no easy narrative. To their fellow Germans, it sounded like a fantasy, or worse, a betrayal. To the Allied occupiers, they were still the enemy, their insights unwanted. So they remained silent, and the memory of the women of Alabama became a permanent, unvoiced part of their inner landscape. This silent memory, however, was a powerful force. It had forever altered their perception of the world. For many of these women, the experience inoculated them against the appeal of any future totalitarian ideology. What happens when a worldview is not just defeated, but completely erased? The legacy of this quiet psychological war would ripple through generations. Hit the subscribe button to continue exploring the hidden fronts of history. For the women who returned, the world was forever divided into two realities, the one they had been raised to believe in, and the one they had seen with their own eyes. This dual vision made it impossible for them to ever again accept the simple, absolute certainties offered by demagogues and dictators. They had seen the strength of a free society up close, and while they may not have loved it, it was too loud, too chaotic, too foreign. They were forced to respect it. They had witnessed firsthand that a nation's power was not measured in the disciplined perfection of its parades, but in the noisy, inefficient, and ultimately unstoppable will of its individual citizens. When they saw the first green shoots of democracy beginning to grow in the rubble of West Germany, they did not meet it with the cynicism of many of their compatriots. They met it with a quiet, reserved, and deeply personal understanding. They had already seen the alternative, and they knew which system was more resilient. Their personal lives were also profoundly changed. The rigid model of German womanhood, the Kinder, Küche, Kirche ideal, no longer held the same power over them. They had seen women who were wives and mothers, yes, but who were also mechanics, farmers, bookkeepers, and community leaders. They had seen that womanhood was not a monolithic category, but a spectrum of possibilities. This did not necessarily turn them into radical feminists, but it planted a seed of independence, a quiet insistence on their own agency. Some of them fought to get an education, others started small businesses. Many simply resolved to raise their daughters differently, to instill in them a sense of self-worth and a belief in their own potential that went beyond the narrow confines of traditional roles. They had seen what women were capable of when they were not constrained by a rigid ideology, and they were determined to pass that silent lesson on. In the end, the story of these German female POWs is a testament to a truth more powerful than any army, that no ideology can survive a sustained, direct collision with a contradictory reality. Their defeat was not just a matter of guns and bombs. It was a conversion experience in reverse. They were not converted to the American way of life, but they were forever deconverted from their own. They became living ghosts in their own culture, carrying within them the memory of a future that their own nation had promised, but had been utterly incapable of delivering. The laughter of the Alabama women, the confidence of the female postmistress, the passionate, amateurish energy of the war bond drive, these were the memories that haunted them, the quiet, persistent reminders that their great sacrifice had been made in the service of a fatal illusion. They had gone to war to build a new world and had, in a small, forgotten corner of America, discovered a better one. Their silence in the post-war years speaks volumes. It is the silence of those who have seen too much, who understand a truth too complicated for slogans. It is the silence of a generation of German women who learned the most important lesson of the 20th century, not in a lecture hall or from a political pamphlet, but in the sun-scorched cotton fields of the American South. The rights and freedoms of their female enemies had not been a sign of weakness, but the ultimate, secret weapon, a weapon that had targeted and destroyed not their bodies, but their souls.